Everyone, sorry for starting a little bit late. We're just waiting on a few more people. So today we're getting together to hear from Glenn Moss, who's just written a book called The New Radicals, talking about student activism, particularly white student activism in the early 70s. And we thought this would be a good opportunity, a little bit different to the last event that we attended with Glenn, where we thought it would be a good opportunity to introduce some young radicals from today to Glenn and see if they can sort of learn from each other. And Glenn can talk about the time that the book talks about, the early 70s, and also talk about some of his experience as an activist. So I'll let Glenn introduce himself and talk about his history, and I'm going to take a seat.
Before we start, I think everyone from EE put up their hands. Equal education. Everyone from SJC, and then there's NU. So welcome to everyone. The reason I thought of doing this was because when we went to, I thought this was especially had to be done for Jared, who you all know, he's NU's deputy director. And after the book launch there, after Glenn had spoken and after the book launch, he came to me and he said, "What was NewSAS?" And clearly, all the people who were under 30 in the room, except for one or two people, didn't know what NewSAS was. And the discussion there was like a discussion among old priests who had gathered and were arguing with each other over the Torah or the Bible or the Quran. And I thought that it would be a very different place to hear Glenn express the history and engage with the history that is written about from his memory as an activist, as a student activist, for him to do it here. I'm going to ask him just to say a few things first, but I want him to start on telling us a little bit about his family background, which is not really in the book.
And it's not really something I prepared for. I think really far back. I was born in Pretoria, the administrative capital of apartheid at the time, and grew up there as a teenager. I was born to a family that I suppose one would see as on the sort of lower middle class cusp of white working class, which meant that my experiences were somewhat different from many of the more elite people that I went to school with. Pretoria was a particularly complicated place for a young person to grow up with, if that young person was something of an outsider, because it was dominated obviously by the structures and administrations of apartheid, the civil service government, the military, the judiciary. In addition to that, there would have been a relatively comfortable white English-speaking community, which, being on the cusp of white working class, I didn't engage with or relate to. And because I had some elements of Judaism in my background, in the sense that my father was Jewish and my mother was not, there would have been a Jewish community, but I was an outsider to that as well. So that meant that both the emerging political outsider status and the emerging social status very early on constituted me as something of a rebellious person, initially in school terms and subsequently in political terms.
Okay. What do you want to tell us about why you wrote this book? And then I've got some very specific questions for you.
You know, there's a narrative, there's a history, which says that South Africa was brought to 1990 and then 1994 through a fairly simple process. There was the international campaign, there were economic sanctions, there was the armed struggle, there was international pressure, There was an alliance within the country of particularly COSATU and the UDF, which created a particular context in which the ANC and its allies became stronger. The government became weaker. There was something of a change in international relations, and we moved into the unbanning of the prohibited organizations and a set of negotiations. It's a very simplistic narrative, that, but apart from being simplistic, what it does is that it cuts out, for me, a critical decade of the 1970s. And if you think of what happened in the 1970s, the prefiguration, the beginnings of everything that happened subsequently are actually embedded there. Because in the 1970s you have got the development of the new trade union movement, initially through the Trade Union Advisory Coordinating Council, which subsequently becomes FASATU, which moves into COSATU. You've got the emergence of a black consciousness movement, which challenges much of what is dominant within apartheid society. You've got the development of a new radicalism, particularly on the white and the black campuses. The white campuses under NUSAS, which we may come to talk about, and the black campuses under SASO. That's a radicalism which challenges what exists. In the 1970s, the critique of a multiracial liberalism as an anti-apartheid strategy is explored and developed more extensively than it has been before. And in addition to that, it's in the 1970s that the big issue of the relationship between the state and the economy, between apartheid and capitalism, and between different classes, begin being raised as part of a Marxist or socialist exploration that is different from the historical Marxism of the Soviet Union, which to date had been, I suppose, at least the dominant form of Marxist analysis around South Africa. Of course, you move into the 1970s, and then there are the massive moments. They're the moments of the Durban strikes, of Soweto 76. They're all linked to what I'm talking about. And when I looked back on the processes of change and contestation in South Africa, I realized that the 1970s had been airbrushed out of that history to some extent because they didn't fit comfortably in to the way in which the narrative I described a little earlier was being created, the way in which victors on the face of it were creating a particular history which excluded other very important parts of it.
So in writing this, you're telling us that if we look at what the ANC is putting out as history, and particularly when it's writing a new history syllabus, it will only mention the ANC's contribution and its version of what the ANC was, not all the different parts that eventually came to be the ANC and be allied to the ANC. It won't give a good history of the black consciousness movement, for example, and of the socialists who influenced the trade union movement, and probably not a good history of the trade union movement as well. And so when you're speaking about airbrushing, it's the 70s which brings all these things together, and it's also helping us get a fuller picture of what happened subsequently.
No, I think that's absolutely correct. You've got to remember that by the end of the 1960s and at the beginning of the 1970s, the alliance which the ANC has put together formally in terms of the Communist Party and SACP, the Congress of Trade Unions, is actually very weak. It's weak externally, but to the extent that it's weak externally, it has almost no presence within South Africa. It is an idea and a history and a set of allegiances, but it's not. It doesn't have an organizational basis, and it's not particularly influential. And there really is something of a political vacuum, which is filled by what I referred to as a multiracial liberalism. In the context of that vacuum, it is a multiracial form of liberalism that really comes to represent opposition to apartheid politics within South Africa. And yeah, it's in that context that some of the new radicalism that I speak of begins emerging. It does not emerge importantly in opposition to the ANC and its alliance, much I might add, as the other dynamics don't in any major sort of way. It almost emerges in spite of. There aren't that many organic or organizational links, just one set of ideas and histories that are engaged with. That's not oppositional to that, but it emerges in spite of.
So now I want to take you into the book. You start with a chap called Neville Curtis, but I'm going to ask you first to tell us about his sister, and at the end of it I'd like you to say to people what happened to his sister. But perhaps start with his sister and then go with, explain to us about him. And yeah.
Jeanette?
So you also have to explain what NewSAS is, starting with him.
Okay.
And liberalism.
Okay, let's just talk very generally about what I mean when I'm talking about a multiracial liberalism, and it's not a deep analysis. It's simply saying at a descriptive level, liberalism in South Africa at the time had multiracialism almost as a non-negotiable mantra. Multiracial is in the sense of the idea that blacks and whites being together was a political statement of opposition in and of itself. In other words, as long as there were black and white people working together within an organization, that was good, that was progressive. It lacks any critique of the relationship between economic development and capitalism and the apartheid state. Liberalism doesn't have that at that particular period over there, and it's often influenced by and affected by a gradualism that is very much promoted by some of the major economic corporations at the time, and it has a view of gradual change which says if the economy can just be released from the constraints of apartheid, it will by itself grow and erode the racism that underpins apartheid. And that's really just a thumbnail summary of what I mean by liberalism at the end of the 19th
Mostly
century.
white. Mostly.
Yes, it was very small and very uninfluential. There were important black liberals, but the liberalism was effectively driven mainly by white liberals, and critically, the organizations' agendas were generally driven and led by white liberals rather than the black liberals in the organizations who tended to be in subdominant positions, subservient positions. Okay, within this context, a short person of enormous energy called Jeanette Curtis emerges out of the NewSAS structures. NewSAS is the National Union of South African Students. Post the banning of the ANC and the smashing of the armed struggle in Rivonia and afterwards, it becomes one of the major voices of a multiracial liberalism based on the white English-speaking campuses and some of the black campuses.
UCT and Wits and so on.
Yeah, that's UCT, Wits, Rhodes, University of Natal, Durban, Pietermaritzburg, some of the teacher training colleges, and then Fort Hare, Turfloop, some of the theological colleges, Federal Seminary in the Eastern Cape, which are black campuses, are also involved, and some of them are even affiliated to NewSAS. But NewSAS becomes an important voice of multiracial liberalism, and within itself as a student organization also challenges that even in the 60s, or individuals challenge that within the 60s. A dynamic woman called Jeanette Curtis becomes involved in NewSAS. She works her way through the structures. I met her in 1970 when she was Transvaal Regional Director of NewSAS, and her role then was to try and coordinate the black and the white campuses in the Transvaal area, the northern area of South Africa at the time, and to try and organize gatherings in which, despite Jeanette's innate radicalism, multiracialism was absolutely essential. She worked terribly hard to get black and white students together within an organizational situation. And of course the irony of that is that is happening at precisely the moment that black consciousness, through the development of SASO, South African Student Organisation, under the early leadership of Steve Biko, is challenging that, and we might actually come to that. Jeanette is a dynamo. She works hard, she has enormous energy, she's brave, she's courageous, she's a good organiser. She works through the new SAS structures in the first part of the 1970s, works full-time in the new SAS head office, which in those days was in Cape Town, just on the road here. Comes back to Johannesburg, forms, and just very simply becomes one of the movers in Johannesburg of the establishment of a new trade union movement, which in Johannesburg is done under the name of the Industrial Aid Society, and there are some chapters on, some sections on that in the book. Jeanette is an activist, but she's also an archivist, she's a librarian. And in trying to gather material on the 1950s and the 1960s in terms of political resistance at that time, she starts making relationships and friendships with some of the older people who are still present from the ANC and from the Communist Party. And she very quickly becomes a contact point between meetings between this older group and a newer group. And as a consequence of that and various other activities, she is banned. People know what banned was. Do you know what banned means? Suppression of Communism Act allowed the government to ban somebody by administrative decree. There were varying degrees of hardship associated with that, but effectively it was a form of self-regulated internal imprisonment. As a banned person, you could not be in any gathering, which was defined as more than one other person. You could not be quoted, you could not address anybody, you could not write anything for publication, you could not go into a school, a university, a factory, a place where anything was published. And it was quite often combined with a house arrest order, which meant you were then confined to your house for normally between 6 in the morning and 6 at night. It was many of the names that you will know were banned. It was normally for a 3 or a 5 year period, and it was effectively a way of trying to pull people, it's a punitive part to it, but also to actually take them out of politics. Shortly after the banning context, Jeanette becomes romantically involved with a recently released political prisoner by named Marius Squirn. And they make a decision for various reasons, including the fact that they believe the net is closing in on them as contact people between a newer generation and an older generation of political activists. They decide to leave the country and settle in Botswana, where they become very central in an ANC and Congress of Trade Unions network within Botswana.
Okay, we'll come back to
what happened to Jeanette.
So her brother Neville.
Neville was her older brother, an enormous man.
I don't see you mention that he's gay in the book.
I probably don't. For no reason other than this I don't. I suppose the point that Zaki would be making is that in the very early 1970s, a student leader who is and ambiguous about his sexual orientation is relatively unusual. Neville was an enormous person, enormous in stature, big in everything that he did, charismatic but introverted, and he plays an incredibly important role in developing the new radicalism on particularly the white campuses that are part of New SAS. He and Steve Biko of the Black Consciousness Movement were actually close friends. They had worked together, and even once Black consciousness technically separated from New SAS, Biko and Curtis worked together fairly closely in the early 1970s as a way of developing a multiple set of strategies to challenge the South African society as it was on a basis of radicalism. Neville was an intrinsically radical person. He did not fit into the mold of at least white student leadership that had largely dominated to date. White student leadership to date, to the time of Neville, at least much of it, I don't want to overgeneralize, but much of it came from an elite. It came from the private schools. It tended to have access to resources and wealth, and parents who were well positioned within the white English-speaking elite. Neville didn't come from those places, and it was reflected. His separation from them, the fact that he wasn't overly influenced, was reflected in his radicalism.
Would you say what you mean by radicalism before you
Sorry?
go any further?
Radicalism. What is radicalism?
Oh yes, we need a radicalism in the early 70s is really more of a process than a program. So I don't want to over-define it, but it is, I think, characterized by a number of components. The one is that it challenges the multiracialism that I'm talking about and inserts in its place what it calls a non-racialism. And that non-racialism is important because being non-racial, it doesn't prioritize race as the only identity. It wants to look at other identities of people. It wants to look at identities that might be associated with class, with gender, though we weren't particularly strong on that, with sexual orientation. It challenges the idea of race as the primary identity in understanding the way South African society works. And the importance of that is that it opens a way to a socialism which sees organizing of the working class as workers rather than as black people, as your way of trying to move the society forward. That's one part of radicalism. A second part of radicalism is that it begins exploring the relationship between apartheid and the economy, between capitalism and the state. Liberalism has seen that and viewed that as something that is antagonistic, that a belief that the apartheid structure, the apartheid state actually limits economic development and economic growth. Radicalism wants to say, no, there's a relationship between them and the two benefit from each other, and apartheid is an important underlying part of economic growth and development at that particular stage. The third is the idea of an imagination. It's an idea of trying to imagine how something can be very different from the way in which you live. In the late 1960s and the early 1970s, for most South Africans, it is hard to imagine the idea of something different. It doesn't matter whether you are somebody living in a black spot subject to, we're going to other things. If you're a rural person subject to the possibility of being forcibly removed into a Bantustan, or if you're a township dweller who is going into the white city each day to work and then returning to the township, or whether you're a worker in a factory.
All white.
You're all white, absolutely all white, or a white student, or somebody who sees themselves going up the white corporate ladder. It's very difficult to imagine that the world can be different. And a man called Rick Turner, who you may or may not have heard of, but who was
coming to my next question.
Oh, okay.
So start with it.
Rick Turner's work and his input as a political philosopher based at the universities, but also working with students and the new trade union movement, is to insist that one needs to be able to imagine an alternative, that it is an error to assume that what exists always has to exist, always natural, always rational, or is right. And that idea of being able to imagine something totally different and then critically start trying to develop strategies and tactics to work towards it is another inherent part of the radicalism of that period.
Do you quickly want to finish on Rick and just tell us what happened to him?
Okay, Rick was, as I say, a political philosopher teaching at the University of Natal, Durban, where his intellectual importance in terms of this idea of an alternative radical socialism that is not totally hamstrung by the narrowness of Soviet communism is very important in intellectual and thinking terms. He also becomes important because he takes that thinking into the foundation of something called the Wages Commissions, the first of which is formed on the Durban campus. And the Wages Commissions are the way in which radical students start relating to the idea of organizing workers, and that in very simple terms is one of the the planks on which the new trade union movement is formed. And Rick is important and influential there.
Can you describe the work of the Wages Commissions quickly?
Okay. The wages commissions are based on the idea of radicalism that I mentioned earlier, in the sense that it wants to actually say there are identities other than race, and one of those key identities is that of worker. And the wages commissions believe that workers have the most important antagonism, the most important difference, hostility towards the apartheid state and the employers, that is actually natural and a part of their very position as workers. Students begin a process of engaging with workers in the factories, initially through research, through representing them in wage negotiations in the state-sponsored structures for applications for wage increases, in education in terms of pamphleting and in terms of newspapers, and on their own campuses. Importantly, they challenge very importantly the way in which the so-called liberal open universities, particularly WITS and UCT, treat their own employees, their own workers. As the wages commissions start developing, so there is this partially spontaneous breakout of what are called the Durban strikes. Enormous, relatively spontaneous, relatively unorganized working class action over a period of time. And this energizes both the wages commission,
which almost about 100,000 workers went on strike almost over simultaneously over a couple of weeks.
Yeah, absolutely. And you've got to remember that firstly striking was illegal. Trade unions for Africans weren't recognized, and very few existed, and those that did exist were fairly compromised. And strikes were illegal and subject to major police action. And there is this rolling striking, factory by factory, that runs through parts of what's then called the Natal area. And this further galvanizes the activity of the wages commissions, and Rick is one of the people that helps to channel that into the formation of off university campus organizations, which are then the planks, the foundation on which the new trade union movement starts in Natal initially, and then in the Western Cape and the Transvaal, and subsequently in other areas. Rick, incidentally, in 1973, is also banned. I explained to you that Jeanette Curtis was banned. She was banned in 1977, if I remember correctly, maybe in 76. Rick is banned at the same time as Neville Curtis, who I spoke to of, and a range of other people, 8 largely associated with the white New SAS campuses people who are banned, and 8 people largely associated with the Black Consciousness movement are banned at the same time. And Rick is banned at precisely that time.
And then what happens to him?
Well, you've got to look at what happened to all of those banned people just on 2 of them. Okay, let's just talk about Rick. As Rick's banning,
back to Biko. I'm going to come back.
You're going to come back to Biko. Okay. As Rick has remained as active as he can in the context of the banning order. He continues to advise some people and intervene when he can. But the notion of the nature of a 5-year banning order does start isolating yourself from that particular society. As his banning order is coming to an end, he is assassinated in the arms of his older daughter Jan, who must have been 12 at the time, or maybe slightly less. But he's assassinated, never absolutely clearly by whom, though clearly somebody operating as an agent of the apartheid state. Never absolutely clear why him at that particular stage, but he is assassinated.
Now, you tell us a story in the book about a meeting with Steve Biko, and when he asked you, how do you feel about being in meetings with black people? And can you just tell us about the influence? You've already hinted about it, but the influence that Biko had. You mentioned his relationship with Neville Curtis, but also with other white students and black students, his impact.
In 1970, which is when I was a 17-year-old having just arrived at university from Pretoria, and I've described my background in Pretoria, and started becoming involved in elements of New SAS, I went to an April seminar. NUSAS ran April training seminars every year. And at that stage, although there was a formal separation between NUSAS and the black consciousness-oriented SASO, some of the SASO leadership retained its linkages and involvement with NUSAS and came to its activities. So at this particular April 1970 seminar, this 17-year-old was confronted by Steve Biko, who was present there and totally involved and engaged and challenging us, and was an incredible influence on those of us as young people, together with Curtis, because they were challenging us on everything. Included drank far too much in those days, and we'd been sitting around a fire, and there was a massive empty big bottle of a cheap red wine called Tassenberg that we had drunk, and Steve had had his fair share of all of this. And he swung round and he said, I want to know how you feel about sitting, engaging with a black person on a basis of equality, a person who knows more than you do, who challenges you, drinking wine with them, eating early. And there's a long silence. And I shuffled my feet and said something very foolish. I said, I'm not actually terribly comfortable. I'm not used to this. I come from Pretoria. The people of colour that I've met have at very most been domestic workers or gardeners. And I believe in multiracialism. I believe we should all be together. But I'm not going to pretend I'm comfortable or that it's easy. And Biko lumbers over to me and lifts me up and picks me up and says, this one understands. It was one of the great moments as a 17-year-old. What he was effectively saying is that's exactly what we're saying. We're saying this pretense at a multiracialism can't work at the moment because of the incredible elements of inequality that we bring into it and the incredibly different sort of components. And I'm not going to say I became a friend of Biko's, I didn't, but I did see him from time to time over the next 5 or 6 years. And that ability to challenge the myths on which part of liberal opposition to apartheid had been built was absolutely fundamental in the development of this new radicalism.
There are two, before I finish, there are two incidents that I want, two campaigns before your trial, and I want you to link all three together. The first is Ahmed Timol, and if you can explain to us about him. And then I want you to tell us about how you caucused to occupy Anglo-American's office during the Western Deep Strike. And the last thing is, of course, your trial, and then I'm going to open it to people to ask questions.
Okay, Timol. There was a system, which you're probably lucky enough not to know too much about, which allowed South Africa's security police to detain people for purposes of interrogation, to hold them in solitary confinement indefinitely, without access to anybody other than the security police, without access to lawyers, courts, family, or anything else like that. And and it was a system that was extensively used and used more and more as the years went on. It's the system under which many people died, including some names you'll know, like Biko, who we were talking of, for example, Neil Aggett, who was a trade unionist who you may know, and many, many other people. Under that system, torture, assault, both physical and psychological torture, became effectively a common practice of extracting information from people, because it was detention for purposes of interrogation, and the security police were entitled to hold a person detained in that way until they felt they had got all the information that they required. It's a system that was so thoroughly shocking that it even stirred the conscience of some otherwise relatively conservative liberal people and institutions. And protest on the NUSAS campuses around the system had been ongoing for quite some time. And there was a build-up and a background of resistance and opposition and protest against this system of detention without trial. That is the background to the detention in 1971 of a man named Ahmed Timol, who was running a small underground Communist Party cell in Johannesburg, mainly associated with the distribution of literature, of pamphlets and publications and various other things like that. Timor was detained together with
Very
a Wit
boring
student.
pamphlets.
Hmm?
Very boring
It's honest,
pamphlets.
but they were. I used to get them in the mail, and sometimes didn't even read them. But they weren't. But it doesn't matter. It was, the strategy was, the ANC alliance, including the Communist Party, knew that it was almost without presence in South Africa. And it saw the distribution of pamphlets as very important in terms of keeping itself alive, and it was probably right. Timor was detained together with a Wit student, a guy called Mohammed Salim-SACP, and various other people, and within a week Timor was dead. It became fairly clear that he had been tortured absolutely shockingly. Whether he had jumped out of John Foster Square to avoid further torture and not reveal the names of other people in his cell, whether he was dangled out of a window and fell as a consequence around all of that, whether he was dead and thrown out of the window, the details don't really even matter. He was quite clearly killed by that system. And at very much the same time, it emerges through various leaks that Salim-SACP, the person he was detained with, who was a Wit student, had been tortured so badly that he was very, very close to death. And we were able to track him down to the hospital he was in and bring court applications as an attempt to protect him, and various other people like that. The Timor event becomes enormous, locally and internationally, and becomes a focal point, not only for protest activity, but because Timor had been associated with underground Communist Party activity, for a linkage between those younger people who were protesting and elements of an older Communist Party and Congress group that is also concerned about what was happening. So that particular campaign, which had enormous consequences, both personally and politically, was a very important moment in the radicalization of a new generation.
Okay. Then tell us about the Western Deep Strike. And you and, who was it, Neville?
No,
Stephen Friedman, focusing.
You know, this has and I come back to why it has this resonance. I was writing the section on what you refer to as the Western Deep Level shootings on the day in which the main day in which the Marikana shootings happened. Now, why is that weird? Because the Western Deep Level shooting on an Anglo-American mine near Carltonville outside Johannesburg is like a mini Marikana in a whole set of ways. Without going into too many details, because it will take too long, effectively the police opened fire on protesting mine workers who have been involved in something of a wage dispute with management. It has been developing on the mine. Police are called in, and with substantial collaboration from Anglo-American, they opened fire, and as far as I can remember, I think it was 12 are killed. I had just become president of the Wit Student Representative Council at the time. And one of my close colleagues was Stephen Friedman, which may be a name you know because he remains a writer and an analyst, had become head of the Wages Commission on the Wits campus. And we looked at each other and we went, Wages Commission, workers, political, radicalization, we need to relate to this issue, not just with shock and horror, but strategically to be able to take it out and further. And we took a decision to call a meeting on the campus and advise, conscientize, educate people as to what had happened at Western Deep Levels, to talk about the involvement and the importance of Anglo-American in all of that, and then to move downtown and occupy Anglo-American's head office, which is precisely what we did. Small action, there probably only 100, 150 of us. The importance of that is, out of those 100 and 150 people who were there, many of whom were young, we probably drew the absolute core of the Wages Commission for the next 2 or 3 years. We drew the core of student involvement in the development of the industrial aid society, it becomes a small textbook case of relating to an issue and strategically engaging with it in such a way that actually takes you forward, rather than protesting against it or just protesting against it.
Okay, so let me tell you quickly the story that he's not telling you. So he meets up with Stephen Friedman, and he says to Stephen Friedman, you talk about how bad the workers' conditions are and why people should join Wages Commission, and I'll suggest that we march. So he spoke, they get into the meeting, there's hundreds of students, and he makes Stephen Friedman speaks about how bad workers' conditions are, and this one gets up and speaks like Julius Malema and says, let's march down to Anglo-American's office, let's go occupy it.
No, that's right. I mean, that is right. It was and it was an orchestrated strategy used quite often, in which I suppose I played the role of which my colleagues at the time said was the rebel rousing, and there were always other people to give the content and the information and the considered view as to why this was legitimate. I suppose it was a form of good cop, bad cop, or something like that.
That brings us to good cop and bad cop. You're right that when one day you got the security police, there was a security policeman who said to me, my name's Spyker van Wyk, I assume you've heard of me. Can you tell us about your trial? And then we finish this. We'll ask some questions. I see there's one or two comrades sleeping. It's very hot in here.
And I'm very boring. Look, I mean, in very simple summary, because the personal stories are in some ways less interesting, I think it's the political issues that come out of it. I spoke to you about the system of interrogative detention with our trial, and I was subject to that for a period of time, which is when this notorious security policeman by name Spyker van Wyk, who had, well, you'll know the name Imam Harun from at least the road. he certainly was involved in killing the Imam in Cape Town, and involved in some of the most excessive brutality of torture. And I had the misfortune to meet him in a half-finished underground parking garage, where I was being transferred from one police station to the other, and that is the moment in which he turns around to me and says, my name is Spyker van Wyk, perhaps you have heard of me. And I really thought that was the end. I'm in a half-finished parking garage with cement and bricks around, and I'm just about to be, no, it didn't happen that way. Okay. Partially as a consequence of the detention and various other things, the state then decided to charge 5 people in what was generally known as the NUSAS trial, people who'd been involved in some of the more radical activities of NUSAS. We were on trial for a year, to some extent for the activities of the Wages Commission and the trade union movement, to some extent the political campaigning that had taken place around it. The importance of it, I suppose, is that it became perfectly clear that the state did not understand the new radicalism that was emerging. And interestingly, running parallel with it was another trial of the leadership of the Black Consciousness Movement. The SASO trial, the SASO BPC trial. And in both of those trials, the most striking point is that the state is trying to fit the new radicalism that has emerged from those campuses and then gone off those campuses into the old mold of conspiracy trials, of armed struggle, of recruitment for military training, and it cannot understand and of Soviet linked communism and Marxism, and it is unable to grasp in any way the fact that this is a different politics and a different form of political activity, not necessarily based on conspiratorial activity. There are conspiracies, there certainly were, but based on a far more politicized public politics, contestation and engagement with what happens within society. That seems to me the most interesting part, the way in which the state, it brings out witnesses who last testified in the Rivonia trial against Mandela et al., or sometimes even in the 1956-1961 treason trial, the massive treason trial of 156 Congress people. And it resuscitates these witnesses to testify against us. And as our lead, our senior counsel, we were privileged to be defended by a remarkably strong team, the leader of which was Arthur Chaskelson, who went on to become the Chief Justice and Chair of the Constitutional Court. And he looks up at one stage. Oh, and George Bezos. They were the two. George and Arthur were my two particular representatives. And Arthur looks up at one stage and says, "How am I supposed to get instructions from my clients on this? He was 2 when it happened." Anyway, that's the trial period. And after, I was lucky enough, partially because of this remarkable defence team I was privileged to have for a year, I was, after a year-long trial, acquitted. My SACP BPC colleagues were less lucky. They were found guilty and sentenced to between 5 and 6 years.
To Robben Island.
Yeah.
Okay. We're going to leave this here and ask people to start asking questions to you. Sure.
Thanks for that talk. What parallels did you draw between like the labor struggles from back in the day with the labor struggles of today? I think it's more a fight against like neoliberalism these days. Still somewhat against the state, yes, but more on an economic level.
You know, there are 2 answers to that very difficult question. The first thing you have to remember is that in the 70s, it is trying to form a labour movement. I mean, it doesn't exist. There are no institutional, organisational structures. So the first predominant component is literally just to organise, to actually form structures of worker participation and worker engagement and involvement. And in the sense that you speak of neoliberalism, that wasn't a term or a context or concept that was used at that particular stage. And it wouldn't even have been seen as organising workers against liberalism. It would be organising workers in the factories and in the shops to be able to, and this is the one side of it, to be able to struggle for and organise towards better working conditions. And at the same time to build up organisations and institutions, trade unions, that can endure and that can survive. And that's really the challenge of that particular time. The other side to it, though, and why it's fairly complex, is that for at least one faction within the labour movement, because as with today there were many factions, one faction also saw the organisation of trade unions as part of a political struggle. Which of its nature was meant to create the preconditions for a more substantial challenge to the state, and in some cases, and I'll try and describe it a little bit earlier, in some cases union organisation as a basis for identifying the most advanced guard of workers for purposes of recruitment, either for military training, to leave the country for military training, to come back as a guerrilla, or to be part of underground cells or structures. The context is so thoroughly different from today's context that I'm not sure that one can draw particularly comfortable parallels. There are, of course, certain elements that are simple, that are there. Differing approaches to politics, differing approaches to the state, differing approaches in those days to the national liberation movements, all of them. Now, of course, to the national liberation movement in power. Different tactical approaches. Those are all there. But I don't think one can draw particularly close parallels, because in the 70s it's really embryonic. It's actually starting to create something rather than a very it's not an industrial relations system. Any semblance of an industrial relations system, at least for African workers, only starts developing 10 years down the line. So it's so substantially different to today's system that I'm not sure one can usefully draw parallels.
Madison.
I have 2 questions, and maybe they're related. How did the less liberal, maybe I can say, white students respond, especially those who weren't, either they were apathetic or not ready to embrace this idea of non-racialism, or probably opposed to it? And secondly, maybe you touched on it when you made the example of the wage commission and that march, but more generally, what strategies did you use to build the organization?
Fascinating questions. Look, as far as what you call the less liberal, and we would have referred to them as conservative students, and there was a strong body of conservative I don't necessarily want to say supporting apartheid in all of its manifestations, but at least broadly supportive of what existed, of a status quo. And it was strong and well organised and numerically fairly strong on certainly on the white university campuses, the ones that I'm talking about. Its reaction is hostile, but in a strange way engaged, a form of conservatism that is almost committed to procedural stuff. They organised their own meetings, they brought their own speakers, they organised their own campaigns, they challenged people at meetings, they put out their own publications. But it was almost a structured resistance to what the emergence of a radicalism was suggesting. And possibly as a consequence, and possibly for other reasons, it started weakening. When I first came to University of Witwatersrand in 1970, the conservatives were very powerful, and they had their own institutions and their own bodies. By 1973 or 74, they had largely dissipated and dropped into almost an apathy. And that may have just been basically because of a comfort. Life was good. There was not an enormous amount to threaten them. The economy was thriving, particularly for them. They had job security almost secured. They had a trajectory of going up the ladder of society just as long as they behaved and continued. And they dropped into something of an apathy and ceased to become any major factor apart from a pool for security, police and intelligence agency to recruit informers from. But yeah, the other group you speak of is in many ways more interesting. A group of students who are sort of broadly concerned but fairly apathetic, a bit uncomfortable with what is going on but not particularly engaged. And that, as student leaders, was our target group, to try and engage with them and take them further. And there is something about that period of the first half of the 1970s which allows for surprising success in that. It's probably a relationship between the particular context in which many young people are moving away from the privilege that has formed them. And that's got to do with a whole set of factors, international factors, lifestyle factors, political factors. In a sense, the sort of glue that holds them to what exists is becoming weaker, and they're more available to be mobilized for oppositional sorts of activity. And it's that group that becomes surprisingly influential and powerful on the campuses I'm talking about in the sort of mid part of the 1970s. And the strategies and tactics are really effectively to reach them and to help them go through a process of both reflection and education, because that's one part of it, and also a process of activism, because our experience is that the combination of the process of reflection, learning, education, engagement, and acting on it is the very, very best cauldron for developing radical activism. And it's that group became very, very substantial and remains substantial. I'm not going to start throwing out names, but we could throw out names of large numbers of people who remain, despite our relative age these days, influential and active in what I would broadly want to call progressive politics, who come from that particular period. You asked another question and I can't read my handwriting. Did I answer both?
Masuli's quickly going to chair. I just want to pop in around the corner to do something quickly. The late one, the one who came very late, is getting.
My job is simple. When someone raises a hand, I'll just.
I'm not sure if you discussed it in your book, but could you tell us a little bit about Raven Press and Work in Progress, and just generally sort of left-wing publishing during this period, which sort of your book ends in the late 70s, 80s, and what happened to this sort of emerging publishing sort of network, and why are we left without one now?
Okay, I mean, firstly, just to explain that what Ben is asking about is out of the time frame of the book, which doesn't matter. The book stops at the end of 1976, quite frankly because it had to. It was getting too long. It was going on for too long. I'd never intended it to stop over there, but it just, so yeah, that's when I cut it. The period you're talking about is in many ways the next phase, the phase that you can talk about as the post-June 1976 phase, where the politics of the society changes in a whole set of ways. And one way in which it changes is that there are a whole set of initiatives to start developing, I suppose, what used to overall be referred to as the alternative press or the alternative media. It was alternative in the sense that it was an alternative to what existed, the mainstream media houses, but it was also alternative in perspective, not only what it covered and wrote about, but how it covered and wrote about. The granddaddy of this was a publication called Work in Progress, which was in many ways the first of them. Well, not exactly. We can fight. The South African Labour Bulletin, which is still around, will say it was the first, but we'll argue. This range of publications, of which Work in Progress was one of the earlier ones, attempted to do a number of things. It attempted to firstly cover and understand and interpret what was happening in the state. How was the state changing? Because the state was changing. It had various initiatives which some would call reform, others would call a restructuring. It had initiatives to try and develop an industrial relations sector, to incorporate the new trade unions. It also became far more militarized at the time under a strategy that was broadly referred to as total strategy. It brought in a military element to its strategy rather than a previous policing and political element. It also tried to cover the emerging new forms of challenge and engagement, the new political organizations, the new trade union movements, the new community groups that create the bedrock for particularly the United Democratic Front to be formed on. And I suppose what Ben is referring to is that I was involved in the foundation of Work in Progress and stayed there for many years, stayed there until 1988. As a whole alternative media developed and grew, moving into newspapers, of which the closest survivor is, I suppose, the Mail and Guardian, in those days called the Weekly Mail. But the Weekly Mail was a alternative newspaper at that particular stage, together with the New Nation and in Cape Town South and Grassroots. There were a set of magazines and journals, and they all tried to bring to bear a critical understanding and a sharing of information on what was happening and how the society was changing. And your question of Raven Press is that in 1980, Raven Press was, I suppose, the leading progressive anti-apartheid book publisher, and by 1988 I was engaged with running Raven Press. It's a slightly different activity in the sense that it's trying to bring the idea of a critical, engaged view and understanding and information base of the world to people, but through books, which are of their nature at the time, smaller readership group than the magazines and the publications.
My question, I guess, relates a little bit to the fact that I'm from the States and have a different or an outsider's perspective on things, but I've noticed that it seems like there's a sense or a desired or forced amnesia among white people in South Africa about this history. And coming from the States, where we've seen obviously that a falsehood of post-racial society or amnesia has been very detrimental to moving forward and actually accomplishing racial and socioeconomic justice in the States. And I'm wondering how now we can sort of combat this forceful amnesia of history, essentially.
You know, one of the
Amnesia
things
means they've forgotten everything. Sorry.
Denial, yeah.
I mean, one of the things that came to mind as you were talking is that there's obviously the sort of joke, but it's a serious joke, which is that it's quite remarkable that apartheid managed to endure for as long as it did, because apparently, if one looks at history at the moment, nobody supported it ever. So yeah, there's and there is that narrative, but I think there's something more important underlying it. I don't think historically, as a society, through any of our processes, including the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, I don't think we've come to understand what apartheid was. Because apartheid was actually a massive system. It wasn't the Truth and Reconciliation Commission tended to deal with it, I suppose, as if it was a set of almost human rights abuses and excesses, which of course it was. But it was a much more substantial system, which permeated into every single element of society and every single structure. You can't deal with apartheid without looking at the way in which people were moved, in which populations were moved and controlled, not only through migrant labour and the pass laws, but through the whole massive social engineering of creating the Bantustans and the reserves. You can't look at a system like detention without trial, which I was speaking about, which is not just the security police torturing people, it's also the whole system that encourages it and protects it, district surgeons, and I suspect that by not properly grappling with an understanding what apartheid was, and in some ways almost dumbing it down a bit, sort of making it simple, we have made it much more difficult to look at the levels of complicity and collaboration in maintaining and developing that system. So I mean, there's no answer there, but I'm saying I think we've actually got to understand our system and our history in a far deeper and more nuanced way than we do at the moment before we can actually deal with its consequences.
I have another question.
Yeah,
Sorry. Are you?
No, you can.
Sorry for stealing time again. But I just want to touch on what you said about non-racialism. My understanding of non-racialism is very different from what you explained now. Basically from varsity, having studied it or being told of it being as, I guess you could say, committing a racial suicide, in that race doesn't matter as an identity. And I remember being in a lecture, being told about non-racialism and feeling completely uncomfortable, especially a white man saying that your race doesn't matter. And now you've explained it quite differently in that, well, I mean, the purpose of that was saying we need to move towards a society where we really embrace non-racialism and it doesn't matter. But you've explained it as race not being a primary indicator of your identity, and other things also should be considered. And I think that to me is something I'd be more welcoming of as an idea. But maybe you can just touch on that and explain that maybe then and now, if it means something different now.
Yeah, I mean, the first thing is to say one's got to be very careful with hindsight.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, I certainly know how I would look at the issues of race and non-racialism and multiracialism now, and I don't really even want to go into that because I think it's got more historical integrity in terms of the way in which we were looking at it at the time. And at the time, it's very close to what you're saying, except that I don't think we were arguing. I don't think radicalism was arguing that race didn't matter or that it didn't have a consequence or an effect. What I think we were wanting to say is that race is not the only identity, and it's not the primary identity in terms of understanding where the most important fault lines are in society. And of course, from our perspective at the time, as budding socialists and Marxists of one sort or the other, we would have prioritized class as the concept that gave us the idea of where the primary fault line was, and the primary fault line was between workers or the working class and I suppose the capitalist class and its allies. And that was where we tried to deal with non-racialism. We obviously struggled. We were attacked very strongly by the movements of national liberation, who said you're trying to ignore a reality of what they would call, it's still called the national question, to which we responded by saying we're not trying to say race doesn't have a consequence or that it doesn't have an identity. And of course, at that stage, it was institutionally and legislatively imposed in all sorts of ways. But what I think we were arguing is that there were other identities that had to be taken seriously in any political strategy that had to try and challenge the society. So like you, I would feel very uncomfortable with anybody saying commit race suicide or something like that, or race doesn't exist or it doesn't matter, because quite clearly it retains a structural resonance and importance which allocates people to various ways. I suppose what we would have argued is that it's not the only identity, and in political strategic terms, not necessarily the primary identity. That would incidentally have been our key difference with black consciousness. Black consciousness would have said, you're wrong about class, it's race that has the primary identity, and it's only by dealing with that primary identity that we can move. Interestingly, if you look at Biko's writings at the time, we could move towards a non-racialism. Biko had a similar view of a non-racialism. He wanted to see race as the way in which one could transcend. One could use race to transcend race to create a non-racialism. I suppose the group of people I was associated with, which I call the New Radicals, wanted to say, no, other identities are the ones that are most important in terms of strategic mobilization to transcend this. Or get beyond it.
We're running out of time, and I want to give people who haven't asked questions yet.
I wonder if you can reflect on, when you look at activism today, in the last 20 years, in whether you see any gaps or areas that you think are so, from your perspective, would be such obvious areas of organizing that are not being touched. And one observation I made while looking at your book was that your activism was so much focused on society as the first respondent, whereas it seems in the last 20 years, for good reason, it's first the state and then society as a kind of way of moving the state. And I wonder if you have any thoughts on that.
It's in some ways the most difficult question that is thrown up that has been thrown up as a result of a book that was supposed to be history, because certainly what I found in a fair amount of the touring I did to promote and launch the book and the seminars I ran is that large numbers of particularly younger people, no, that's not true, large numbers of people, including my generation, want to use the book to find a way to talk about contemporary politics and the assessments and understandings of contemporary politics. The book wasn't written with that in mind. I'm glad if some of the methodologies actually do that. There are some areas in which the activism of the last 20 years is in such a substantially different context. Structurally, institutionally, we are a constitutional democracy. That means we are based on a universal franchise. These were all dreams that we had, which many of us didn't believe we would actually live to see. It would take, that makes a totally different context. So, for example, the context of an activism now, which tries to hold a state to account in terms of what it is supposed to deliver in terms of a mandate or a policy or a constitution, could not even have been dreamed of in strategic terms at the time. In strategic terms, the goal, one of the goals, was to weaken the state in every way possible, rather than to try and force it to deliver on anything. So I think in that sense the differences are so substantial that there aren't parallels. Where there may be parallels is around the idea that I mentioned earlier of your best forms of the development of an activism that is radical is a relationship between criticism and understanding and engagement. And I suppose that may have been one of the weaker areas in the earliest time, in the immediate post-1994 period, in which, with some notable exceptions, it was a sense of almost a celebration of what existed and what had come to pass, rather than an ability to engage critically with what was from a very early period on starting to go wrong. And I think that the the model that I speak of from the early 70s, in which there is a mixture of thought, of analysis, of interpretation, of education, of information, of critical thinking, and acting. Second part to that, the idea of an alternative, and third part, acting towards it on some sort of strategic and tactical basis, I think remains something that is worthwhile exploring and developing in the current context. Related to that would be the one throwaway comment I made about the glue that held privileged people to a support for the status quo in the 70s starting to dissolve a little bit. Of course, we have our own particular structures of privilege and vested interest in our new society, and probably an exploration of how strategically one tries to loosen that glue, including in student situations, is something where I think one could usefully use some of the history of the 70s and even the 80s. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you. I'm going to ask you just to finish off by telling people a little bit about what happened to Jeanette Squin. Jeanette Curtis.
Okay, in the story, Jeanette had gone into exile in Botswana with her husband Marius Squin. They had 2 small children, and Jeanette was particularly active in SACP, the South African Congress of Trade Unions, which is an exiled trade union grouping that is one part of the Broad Congress Alliance. And Marius is active within ANC intelligence structures and possibly some military structures. As the South Africans become more intent on attacking and undermining people in the frontline states, Botswana, Swaziland, Lesotho, Mozambique, in the frontline states who are working actively for the ANC and for the military struggle, so their attacks and raids into those areas and assassination squads and bomb blasts become more and more dangerous. And at a critical moment in Botswana, Jeanette and Marius are told they're on a list that for attack, and they would be well advised to move to Angola for safety purposes, which they do. And they moved to Angola, and they're in a village in Angola. And Marius is away somewhere, and a parcel arrives for Jeanette in her house one day. She's with her 2 children, and she opens the parcel, and it's a parcel bomb, and it explodes. And it kills her, and it kills her eldest daughter, Katrin, and her son survives the blast. And the bomb had been sent by a security police squad, which was largely organized by a policeman by the name of Craig Williamson, who had known Jeanette well because he had been an infiltrator in student politics, including the student politics I've been involved in. And he had known Jeanette, and he had worked with Jeanette, and he coordinated the particular bomb squads that put together this bomb and sent it to their house in Angola, which killed her.
Okay, so we want to say thank you very much, and we really appreciate you coming out, and also thank you to everyone for coming. And next time you shouldn't be so quiet.
And just from my side, thank you very much. I enjoyed talking with you, and I enjoyed your questions and probing enormously. And if any of you feel strong enough or brave enough to actually want to read the book, I'm going to put a couple of copies with NU's permission into their library, and hope that it will be read and used.
Thank you, it will be.